Hey everyone, welcome to Fat Apocalypse Fat Burning 101. How to fire up fat burning hormones and exactly what blunts them. What blunts fat burning hormones? So essentially there's a couple of different things to think about here. And the first aspect is insulin. Now insulin is created in the pancreas and its role is to either put blood sugar or put sugar into your bloodstream or take it from your bloodstream. It's to control blood sugar levels. Now, when insulin is high, adrenaline is low, and when adrenaline is high, insulin is low. Insulin is essentially, usually in most people, a fat storing hormone, and adrenaline is normally a fat burning hormone. So, depending on what insulin does, will have a big variation in your fat burning potential. Now, I'll give you an example of this when it comes to carbohydrates and eating food at the wrong times and how it plays a role with insulin. If you ate a meal, if you ate some carbohydrates after you did some weight training, the response in your body would be completely different than if you ate some carbohydrates on a day that you've been sedentary for a week and hadn't done anything. Now, on the day that you'd been sedentary for the week and hadn't done anything and you ate the carbohydrates, your body essentially says the muscle stores are full. You haven't used anything in the muscle stores, so I'm going to push all this blood sugar in your bloodstream into your fat stores and store it as body fat. And that's essentially the storage system. If you had been weight training and then you had your carbohydrates, your body says, right, there's empty stores in the muscles, and I'm going to store this sugar in the bloodstream as glycogen in your muscle cells. Now that's the best situation you can get. Most people don't get it right though. They don't know when to consume carbohydrates and they don't know when to consume just foods in general and how that response in your body varies. So that's why this program is so important. And we obviously reasonably loose with the meal timing, but it's why we are structured with the refeeds and what you have to do around the refeeds and why you have to train on the day of the refeeds and certain aspects like that, because in order to use those carbohydrates optimally, you need to create the right type of insulin environment, and most people don't do that. But that's why you're here to learn how to use insulin to make it actually work for you. When you can store sugar in your muscles, that's a good thing. When you can store it in your fat cells, not so good. So the next aspect is lack of sleep. Now, with lack of sleep, this affects everything. Obviously, lack of sleep affects aging. You're 50% more likely to be overweight or have diabetes or heart disease if you sleep 5 hours less a night. So, just the fact that you're 50% more likely to be overweight tells you that lack of sleep has an effect in blunting fat burning potential. Essentially, as it drives up your stress hormones, that's those stress hormones, that cortisol has a cascading effect that also affects insulin. It will start to force that sugar and all those things into your fat stores, and it makes you very resistant to fat loss. So that's why lack of sleep is such a thing that you really want to work on changing and improving. The next aspect is unbalanced nervous system or sex hormones. So an unbalanced nervous system is essentially, you have two sides to your nervous system. You have the stress side and you have the rest and digest side. The rest and digest side is the side that does a lot of the digestion and absorption of food, where you're calmer and get some balance. The stress side is essentially your flight or fight response. That's usually the one that's elevated and dominant most of the time because of the type of society and culture that we live in. The side effect of that is it's going to affect the quality of your sleep. It's going to affect your elevated stress hormones and other things like that. So, in terms of balancing the nervous system, you need to work on things like Tulsi tea, theanine, serene, or magnesium. Getting 6 to 8 hours of sleep a night. No artificial light 30 minutes before you go to bed. So, no computers, cell phones. The artificial light is going to block your melatonin production, which is going to prevent you from getting into quality sleep. Leisure walking, deep breathing, meditative forms of yoga, different things like that. You need to work on balancing that nervous system stress. It's about stress management. The next part is sex hormones. Now, insulin is usually the precursor to a sex hormone imbalance, and sometimes it's vice versa. If you have an estrogen dominance and you're a male, it usually means that you're insulin resistant. And if you have insulin resistance and you're a female, it usually means that you have more testosterone. Now, what you want to understand here is that sex hormones and other hormones are all interrelated. So when it comes to sex hormones, all the stuff in terms of getting more sleep, balancing your nervous system, watching the type of foods you eat, doing the weight training, all those things will not only help balance the insulin, it's going to help balance the sex hormones and other things as well. But the main thing to understand is that insulin will play a double role, and that's why it can potentially blunt your fat burning. So, what fires up fat burning essentially? Basically, what it is it's a neurotransmitter hormone called adrenaline or noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine. And these are catecholamines that are produced in the body that essentially rev up our internal engine. It's like a shot of, you know, fire in the internal engine, and it gets things going even quicker. Usually, and for most people, adrenaline is highest first thing in the morning when you first wake up out of deep sleep through cortisol, and it's usually higher because you haven't eaten. Now, when you haven't eaten, your insulin isn't responding, and because of that, your adrenaline goes up. When you eat, your insulin gets released and your adrenaline goes down, which is often why, we will, tell people that, if you're going to train in the morning, to train in a fasted state. And I'll talk about that in a second. Or at least wait a few hours before you eat, because just doing that will give your body a little bit more time to fire up adrenaline before you begin to blunt it slightly with that insulin release. By the end of the day, you've had so many insulin spikes from the meals you've been eating that your adrenaline is much lower and your fat burning potential is much lower by then. The next aspect of this to focus on is caffeine and stimulant balance. Now, the thing with caffeine is that in our society, for the most part, most people massively overconsume caffeine. They're caffeine addicts, they're stimulant abusers essentially, and they consume far too much of it just to be able to function. And often the reason for that is because they're eating too much sugar and the insulin spikes are so violent and high, and they crash so rapidly that they need some kind of stimulant to pick them back up again. But when it comes to caffeine, it can work in your favor as well. One thing, black coffee, it's got a high in antioxidants, so it's going to be good for you in that respect in terms of helping clear your body of oxidative stress, which is essentially cell buildup, which increases the aging process. So it's going to help slow that down. The other aspect is caffeine at certain times of the day is going to help with fat burning, but it has to be in, obviously moderate amounts, just single servings, but and in time with, yourself, your own body. Some people are very, you know, um, tolerant to caffeine. Other people aren't. If you're not tolerant to it, just leave it out. If you are tolerant to it, you're just going to have to learn to live on less, because caffeine can work against you. If you have too much of it, it can drive up your stress hormones too much, which you're going to kick that belly fat storing mode back in again. So you need to be aware of that. But down to cortisol rhythm, I'll jump past fasted training quickly and I'll get back to that. With cortisol rhythm, this ties in with caffeine. So your cortisol is naturally at its lowest at about 9 a.m. and 2 to 3 p.m. During those times are usually the best times to use caffeine because it's at its lowest, so you're not magnifying the response when it's actually higher. Your cortisol is going to be higher when you first wake up in the morning. I will usually get up at about 4:30, and I'll have my coffee at 6 a.m. That's still probably too early, but in terms of my training, I'm training at 6:30 in the morning, so it's the best that I can do. And usually having caffeine right before you train, as long as it's not at nighttime, is going to be a good thing. If you're training in the morning, do black coffee in the morning. Otherwise, if you're training at nighttime, I wouldn't even use caffeine because it's going to keep you awake all night, and that lack of sleep is going to do more damage than anything else. So that cortisol rhythm is going to be lowest at its 9 a.m. and 2 to 3 p.m. So that's when you want to use it. In fact, it's probably more like 1 to 3 p.m. So if you can get it in earlier, say 1 p.m., that's probably even better. The later it is, the probably the worse it's going to be. The next part is fasted training. With that, essentially, it just means that you're going into the training session, you're just using branched chain amino acids, you're not eating, especially if you train in the morning, you're not eating before you train. What it does is that rather than your body using the calories that you just eaten as energy, your body's kicking in and taking fat stores as energy. And that's why we tell you to not eat right before you train, even if it's later in the day, because one, we want those calories to pass through your system first so you can tap into your fat stores. And two, so much blood is sent to your digestive system to break down that food and absorb it that blood leaves your brain, heart, and muscles. So it's going to impair your exercise when you do it. So we want you to have peak performance, and that's why you want to wait that time. So essentially, that is basically the overview. In terms of fat burning 101, your adrenaline is going to be your main fat burner. The ways to just increase that naturally in a good way is a little bit of caffeine. And when I say a little bit, I mean a little bit. And faster training in the morning and just holding off on your first meal first thing in the morning for a couple of hours to increase that amount of time your adrenaline is running higher before it starts to get blunted by insulin. So that is it. If you have any questions about when you're training, when you're eating, your caffeine intake, anything that revolves around your fat burning, just post them in the group and we'll gladly help you out.